She found him alone in a frozen field at dawn, barely breathing, his coat matted with ice, too weak to lift his head. No mother, no tracks, no sign of anyone. Most people would have called someone, maybe walked away. She got down on her knees in the mud and snow and put her hands on his chest. What happened next changed both of their lives in ways she never could have predicted. Now, before we get into this story, I want to ask you something, and I mean this seriously. Have you ever had a moment where you weren't sure if you were saving something or if something was saving you? Because that's exactly what this story is about. A widow, a dying foal, a freezing November morning, and something that passed between them that I honestly don't know how to explain in any other way than to just tell you what happened. If that's the kind of story that gets into your chest and stays there, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world people who feel things deeply actually live. Now, let's go back to Granger County, Tennessee. November, the coldest morning of the year. Nadine had lived on that property for 31 years. She'd moved there as a young bride, 22 years old, with a second-hand truck and a cedar chest full of quilts her grandmother had made. The land, 43 acres of rolling pasture, 2 creeks, and a tree line that turned amber every October like the world was trying to show off, had never fully belonged to her, not on paper, not until the morning she buried her husband Stuart and became the sole name on the deed. That was 4 years before the Foal. Stuart had been a quiet man, the kind who communicated most of his love through action. He fixed things before they broke. He left her coffee already made every morning. He held her hand during the long, silent drives they took on Sunday afternoons, through country roads neither of them bothered to name. He died the way he'd lived, without fuss, without drama. A heart attack on a Tuesday in March. He was 61 years old. She found him in the barn, still in his work gloves, like he'd just sat down for a minute and forgotten to get back up. After Stuart died, Nadine kept the animals. 2 dogs, a border collie named after a jazz musician she'd loved since college, and a hound mix who slept on Stuart's side of the bed and didn't seem to understand why it was now always cold. She kept the chickens. She kept the garden, though she let it grow smaller each year. And she kept the horses, 3 mares who'd been part of the property so long they seemed structural, like the fences or the water troughs, things the farm wouldn't know how to be without. She did not keep the grief hidden. That was one thing people noted about Nadine. She didn't perform toughness. She cried at the kitchen table. She cried in the truck. She cried when she found one of Stuart's flannel shirts still folded in a drawer, months after she'd given everything else away. But she also got up every morning. She drove into town. She helped at the church pantry on Thursdays. She called her daughter, Priya, every Sunday. She was grieving and she was living, both things at once, and she had decided not to choose between them. The farm kept her anchored. That was the truth of it. The animals needed feeding at the same hour every day, and the land had no patience for self-pity. It needed tending. She tended it. By the 4th year, she had settled into something that wasn't quite peace, but wasn't quite sadness either. A kind of steady, dignified ache, like a note held just a breath longer than comfortable. She had friends. She had her routines. She had her land. She had her horses. She did not have enough, but she had enough to keep going, and sometimes that's the whole story. Until the morning of November the 14th, she'd woken at 5:15, which was her habit. The sky was still black, and the temperature had dropped overnight to the low 20s, cold even for that part of Tennessee in that season. The kind of cold that cracks the ground and turns puddles to small mirrors. She dressed in layers, pulled on her boots, poured her coffee into the thermos Stuart had given her years ago and that she continued to use not out of sentimentality, but because it was simply the best thermos she'd ever owned. She walked out to check the mares. They were fine. All 3 standing in the run-in shed, warm and unbothered. She counted them, checked the water, noted the hay levels. Then she turned to walk back toward the house. That's when she saw it. Across the second pasture, near the line of cedar trees that marked the back edge of her property, there was a shape on the ground, dark against the snow. Small, She stood still for a moment. In 31 years, she had learned to read her land the way some people read faces, and she knew immediately that the shape was wrong. It was too still, too low, too small. She set her thermos on the fence post. She walked. By the time she reached the cedar trees, she could see it clearly. A foal, a colt, she would determine moments later. He was on his side in the frozen grass, legs folded beneath him in that way that newborns fold before they've learned the mechanics of standing. His coat was dark bay, deep brown with a blackish mane already stiff with frost. His nostrils were flaring, but just barely. His eyes were open and they tracked her when she moved, which meant something. There was no mare, no hoofprints approaching from anywhere she could read. Nothing in the tree line, just the foal and the cold and her. She stood over him and felt something shift in her chest. She had no idea where he'd come from. She had no idea if he would survive the next hour. She had no idea what she was about to take on. She got down on her knees anyway. Later, she would say to Priya, to her neighbor Gwen, to the vet, to anyone who asked, that she didn't think, she just moved. And that was true, more or less. The part of her brain that calculated odds and weighed costs had gone quiet. What remained was older, steadier, something close to instinct. She pulled off her outer coat and laid it over the foal's body. He flinched when she touched him, which she took as a good sign. Flinching required energy. Energy meant there was still something to fight for. "Okay," she said out loud, to him and to herself and to the cold morning. "Okay, I've got you." She ran back to the house. The next 20 minutes were a blur of phone calls and movement. She called the vet, a large animal specialist named Dr. Calloway, who operated out of a practice 40 minutes south and had been the farm's vet since Stuart was alive. She called Gwen, whose property adjoined hers on the east side and who had more livestock experience than almost anyone in the county. She filled 2 5-gallon buckets with warm water and dragged out the stock trailer's heavy wool blankets and found the bag of colostrum supplement she kept in the barn for emergencies, because that was the kind of woman she was, prepared for things she hoped would never happen. She went back to the foal. He hadn't moved, but he was still breathing, and when she knelt beside him again and put her bare hand against the side of his neck, she could feel a pulse, faint and rapid, but there. She covered him more carefully this time, tucking the blanket underneath him on one side, and began to gently rub his legs, working circulation back into the muscles the way she'd once read you were supposed to do. She talked while she worked. She didn't plan the words, they just came. She talked about Stuart, about the farm, about the way the sun would hit those cedar trees in late afternoon and turn them gold, about how he used to whistle while he worked and never seemed to know he was doing it. She talked about Priya's first word, which had been more, because of course it had. She talked about nothing and everything, and the foal lay still beneath her hands and breathed. Gwen arrived first, in her old blue pickup, moving fast, already pulling on gloves before she'd fully stopped. She was a broad-shouldered woman of 67, with close-cropped silver hair and a disposition that people sometimes mistook for severity, but was actually just efficiency. She'd raised cattle and horses on her land for 4 decades. She did not panic. "Newborn," she said, crouching beside the foal and lifting one of his eyelids gently. "Hours old, maybe. Not a day." "Where did he come from?" Nadine asked. "Could have come through the tree line from the Caldwell acreage. That property's been sitting empty since May. Someone could have put a mare out there and not realize she was close." Gwen shook her head slightly. "Or someone knew and didn't care." Nadine didn't say anything to that. She kept rubbing the foal's legs. "He drink yet?" "I don't know. I found him like this." Gwen opened the colostrum supplement Nadine had brought and mixed it with the warm water with practiced efficiency. "He needs this in the next hour or we're in trouble. The antibody window closes fast. They tried to get him to drink. It wasn't simple. A foal that has never nursed doesn't automatically understand what you're offering. The instinct is there, but the coordination isn't, especially in a hypothermic animal." Gwen held his head. Nadine worked the bottle. He resisted, then accepted a little, then resisted again. They were patient. Neither of them spoke, except to direct each other in low, calm voices. By the time Dr. Calloway arrived, a lean man in his early 50s named Theodore Calloway, who everyone called Theo, the foal had taken nearly half the bottle. Theo examined him quickly and thoroughly, speaking in the flat, informational tone vets use in crises to keep everyone's adrenaline from boiling over. Core temps low, but not catastrophic. Lung sounds aren't great. There may be some aspiration from lying in the cold. We need to get him up and moving as soon as he's stable enough. He straightened. You prepared to take this on, Nadine? I already am, she said. Theo looked at her for a moment. He'd known her since before Stuart died, had treated her animals for more than a decade, and he knew the particular quality of her stubbornness. It was not reckless. It was the stubbornness of someone who understood cost and chose to pay it anyway. All right, he said. Let me show you what you're doing. They got the foal into the barn. It took all three of them, and the foal, who contributed in uncoordinated, earnest lurches that kept threatening to become falls and never quite did. Nadine had set up a stall with deep straw bedding and a heat lamp angled carefully overhead. She'd done this while Gwen held the animal, moving with a speed and focus that surprised even her. Getting him settled took another hour. Theo set up an IV for fluids and electrolytes. He showed Nadine how to check the foal's gum color, how to read the subtle signs of improvement or decline. He left her with medication instructions written in his small, neat handwriting on a notepad and a phone number to call at any hour. He's a fighter, Theo said at the door, pulling on his coat. But this next 24 hours is everything. After he left, after Gwen had squeezed her shoulder and driven home, Nadine sat down in the stall with the foal. The barn was warm now, or warm enough. The heat lamp hummed. Her three mares shifted quietly in their stalls across the aisle, aware that something unusual had happened, that the normal order of the morning had been suspended. The foal's breathing had steadied. He was lying on his chest now, which was better. His eyes, when they found her, stayed there. Nadine reached out and laid her hand on the side of his face. His ear turned toward her, that small, involuntary pivot. "You're going to be okay," she said. She didn't know if that was true, but she said it like she meant it, because she did. She named him on the second day. She hadn't planned to name him that fast. Naming implied a future, a claim, a commitment she wasn't sure she was ready to make, while his survival was still uncertain. But on the second morning, when she came into the barn at 5 a.m., and he lifted his head before she even reached his stall, and when his ear turned toward the sound of her footsteps, the way it had been doing every single time, she found herself saying it without thinking. "Good morning, Weston." She didn't know where the name came from. It arrived in her mouth fully formed, like something she'd been carrying without knowing it. She stayed with it for a moment, turning it over. It was a good name, solid, a little old-fashioned. It suited him. "Weston," she said again. He blinked. The second and third days were the hardest. His temperature remained unstable, spiking slightly on the second afternoon in a way that sent her to the phone in a controlled panic. Theo came out again, adjusted the medications, stayed an hour, told her she was doing everything right. That night she slept in the barn. She brought out a sleeping bag and a pillow and lay in the stall with Weston's warm, slightly unsteady breathing, the last sound she heard before she fell asleep. Weston had no mother, which meant the full weight of what a mother provides fell to Nadine. Warmth, touch, nutrition, safety. She fed him on a strict schedule, every 2 hours initially, then stretching to 3 as he grew stronger. She rubbed him down after each feeding, because foals need to be touched, need the pressure and the contact, need to know that something larger than themselves is present and not threatening. She talked to him, always. There were fewer words about Stuart now. Mostly, she just narrated what she was doing, what was coming next, what the weather looked like outside, what she'd had for dinner. Gwen came by every afternoon to help with the feedings and check his progress. She brought over a bottle of her own mare's milk that she'd managed to collect from a recent foaling on her property, frozen in small portions that Nadine could thaw and supplement with. This made a significant difference. A foal raised entirely on formula often struggles. This gave Weston something closer to the real thing. On day 4, he stood on his own. Nadine saw it happen. She was mucking the next stall when she heard the scramble of hooves on straw, the sound of a creature trying to organize its own legs into a coherent plan. She turned around. Weston was up, shaking hard, all 4 legs splayed like table legs set too wide, but up. His ears were forward. He was looking directly at her. She put down the pitchfork. She walked to the stall door, slow and steady, so as not to startle him. She opened it. She stepped in. He didn't back away. She put her hand on his forehead, between his eyes, and he leaned into it. She laughed. For the first time in longer than she could account for, she laughed. And it wasn't a polite laugh or a social laugh. It was the kind that comes from something genuinely releasing, something you've been holding so long you'd stopped feeling its weight. "You ridiculous little creature," she said. He swayed. His knees buckled and caught. He held. Over the next week, he progressed from standing to tentative steps to actual walking, though his gait had all the architectural confidence of a newborn giraffe. All improvisation and faith. He was curious about everything. He nosed at the water bucket. He investigated the corner of the stall with focused intensity. He learned quickly that the dogs, who came in from time to time, were not threats, and he extended his nose to sniff them with exactly the kind of trust that makes horses so heartbreaking to know. He learned, above all, that Nadine was the constant. She was the one who came when he called, and he called at first whenever she left his sight, a high, thin sound that she could hear from the house and that pulled her back to the barn without her deciding to go. It was purely biological on his part. She understood that. He had no mother, and his nervous system had decided she was it. It was an accident of proximity and need. But something had also shifted in Nadine. She noticed it the way you notice a change in light, gradually, and then all at once. The weight she'd carried since Stuart died, that specific colorless gravity of being alone in a place made for two, had moved, not gone. She didn't think it would ever fully go. But it had rearranged itself around something new, something warm and loud and in constant need of feeding. She mentioned this to Priya on their Sunday call about 3 weeks after finding Weston. "It sounds like he found you," Priya said. "I found him," Nadine corrected. A pause. Are those different? Nadine thought about the shape in the snow, the way she'd set her thermos on the fence post, the way her legs had just started walking. "I'm not sure," she admitted. By December, Weston was 3 weeks old and had developed opinions. He had opinions about which stall he preferred, the one closest to Nadine's 3 mares, but particularly closest to the eldest, a chestnut named after no one in particular, though the barn had always called her May. He had opinions about feeding schedules, specifically that they should happen now, regardless of what the clock said. He had opinions about being groomed, which he loved, and about having his feet picked, which he tolerated with an expression of profound, theatrical suffering. He had opinions about Nadine. She was, in his estimation, the center around which all things correctly orbited. When she was in the barn, he was settled. When she was absent, he was vocal. When she appeared at his stall door after a gap of more than an hour, he greeted her with a full-body enthusiasm, neck stretched, nostrils wide, a low, soft nicker that she had come to love more than she would have ever predicted. She had not expected this. She had cared for animals her entire adult life, had loved them, had mourned them, had invested in their well-being with consistency and warmth. But Weston was different. The circumstances of his beginning, the cold, the urgency, the nights in the stall, had created something between them that bypassed normal. They had skipped the gradual accumulation of trust and gone straight to something more foundational. The county had put out a quiet inquiry through the Agricultural Extension Office about the foal's origins. A few weeks after his discovery, they traced him to a situation that Theo described to Nadine as neglect by abandonment. A mare that had been left on an unmonitored property and had foaled alone, then apparently wandered, or been removed by the time anyone noticed. The mare, it turned out, had been located, thin but alive, now in the care of a rescue operation 2 counties over. There was no owner willing to claim either animal, which meant Weston, legally and practically, had become Nadine's. She called Priya to tell her. "Of course he did," Priya said. "I didn't plan for this." "I know, Mom. That's usually how the best things work." Nadine didn't disagree. The practical reality of raising a foal without a dam, a mother horse, is more demanding than most people imagine. Foals nurse up to 7 times an hour in their first days of life, and while the frequency diminishes with age, the nutritional and behavioral needs remain intensive for months. Nadine had restructured her entire schedule around Weston's needs. She rose earlier. She went to bed later. She drove to the feed store more often. She had developed through necessity the specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from overwork, but from sustained attentiveness, the tiredness of someone who is never fully off duty. And yet, she kept thinking about what Priya had said, about the best things working that way, arriving unplanned from the frozen edge of a field in the dark, needing everything. Her neighbor on the western side, a retired schoolteacher named Inez, who had lived alone since her own husband passed a decade earlier, came by one afternoon with a casserole and stayed for 2 hours watching Weston move around the small paddock Nadine had set up for his daily exercise. "He follows you," Inez observed. "He does," Nadine agreed. "All the way around?" "Every step." Inez watched him, the little bay horse moving steadily behind Nadine, pausing when she paused, changing direction when she changed direction, maintaining exactly the distance of a foal from its mother. "That's not nothing," Inez said. "No," Nadine said. "It isn't." There was a particular moment she returned to, again and again, in the weeks that followed. It happened on a Thursday evening, about a month after she'd found him. She'd finished the evening feeding and was sitting on a hay bale at the edge of the paddock, just resting, letting the cold air clean her head after a long day. The sky had gone purple, and the first stars were just showing. The farm was settling into its nighttime sounds, the creak of the barn wood, the soft movement of the mares, the dogs somewhere near the house. Weston came and stood directly in front of her. He stood close enough that she could feel his breath on her forehead, warm, hay-scented, rhythmic. He didn't nuzzle her or do anything dramatic. He just stood there, breathing, present. She looked up at him. He looked at her, and something passed between them in that long, still moment that she couldn't have put into language if she'd tried. Not sentiment, not metaphor. Something realer than both of those. The specific gravity of 2 creatures who had found each other in the cold and chosen to keep showing up. She put her hand on his chest. She felt his heart. It was steady, strong. Nothing like the flutter she'd felt that first morning in the frozen grass. He was alive. He was warm. He was hers. She sat there until the sky went fully dark, and she did not feel alone. January arrived the way January always did in Granger County, without apology. The temperatures dropped into the single digits, the creeks froze at their edges, the dirt roads turned to iron, and the sky sat low and colorless for days at a stretch. Most mornings Nadine drove the mile to her mailbox wearing 3 layers and a hat pulled down to her eyebrows, and the walk from the house to the barn felt like something you had to steel yourself for. Weston had never known any other weather. He had come into the world in November cold and continued in January cold and seemed entirely unbothered by this. In fact, he seemed to regard his own vigor as a kind of joke the universe was playing on everything around him. The elderly mares, the sluggish chickens, Nadine herself, who did not love cold the way he appeared to. He had grown noticeably in 6 weeks. His legs, which had been comically uncertain in the early days, had developed into something approaching coordination. He ran in the paddock now, actual running, not the stumbling improvisation of infancy, but real movement, a preview of what he would one day become. He was quick, and he knew it, and he used his speed in the way young animals use their best quality, without modesty. He had also, in January, begun to do something new. It started small. Nadine would be in the barn working, mucking stalls, distributing hay, the 1,000 small repetitive tasks of livestock maintenance, and she would become aware that Weston had gone very still, not the stillness of sleep or inattention, but a different kind, a watching stillness. He watched her hands, he watched her movements, he watched her face. She noticed it first on a Wednesday in the second week of January. She had been moving hay bales from the back of the barn and had stopped to rest, her hand pressed against the wall, her breathing slightly labored. She'd been fighting off a cold for 3 days and was running below capacity. She hadn't said anything to anyone. She just kept moving. When she stopped, Weston came to the gate of his paddock and stood there, not calling, not asking for food, just standing, watching her with those large dark eyes. She straightened. "I'm fine," she told him. He continued watching. She went back to work, and after a few minutes she glanced over and he had returned to his hay. But the quality of his attention had been unmistakable. She mentioned it to Gwen. "Horses do that," Gwen said, without a great deal of surprise. "The sensitive ones especially. They read you. It's not magic. It's just observation. They're prey animals. And their survival has always depended on reading the emotional state of the herd. He's put you in his herd." "He's put me in his herd," Nadine repeated, "at the center of it from what I've seen." She thought about that. She thought about the herd, the irreducibly social nature of horses, their hardwired need for others, their distress when isolated. A horse alone was not in any meaningful biological sense a horse at peace. They needed a herd. They needed to know someone was there. She understood this in a new way. She had been alone, not isolated, not friendless, but alone in the specific way that grief makes you, for 4 years. And she had managed, and she had continued, and she had kept the farm going and the friendships alive, and the Sundays with Priya on the phone. But there had been no one at the center of her herd. There had been no one in that particular position. And now there was this small, peculiar, enormously opinionated horse who had arrived out of a frozen field and apparently decided, without anyone asking him, without any documentation or discussion, that she was it. One evening, a neighbor's teenage son named Callum stopped by with his mother to see the foal he'd been hearing about. He was 16, quiet in the way some teenagers are when they're not performing anything for anyone, and he stood at the paddock fence watching Weston with an expression Nadine recognized, the expression of someone encountering something they don't have a word for yet. "He's cool," Callum said, which was clearly not the full extent of what he meant. Weston, for his part, came directly to Callum, sniffed his jacket, then stepped back and looked at him with those steady, considering eyes. "He does that with everyone," Nadine said. "Takes the measure. What's he figure out?" She thought about it. "I think he figures out if you're safe." Callum looked at her, then back at Weston. "How do you know if you passed?" "He stays," Nadine said. "If he walks away, that's your answer." Weston had not walked away. In the last week of January, Nadine got a call from a woman at an equine rescue organization 2 counties over, the same one that had taken in Weston's dam. The woman's name was Odie, and she was warm and direct and called about the mare's condition and recovery, but then mentioned that she'd heard through the county's informal livestock network about the foal and what Nadine had done. "I've been doing this work for 15 years, Odie said, "and I want you to know what you did that morning, getting on your knees in the snow without anyone asking you to. That's not common. That's not nothing." Nadine held the phone and looked out the kitchen window. She could see the barn. She could see the paddock. She could see Weston moving in his easy, rolling way along the fence line, stopping to sniff at something, moving on. "He made it easy," she said. A pause on the line. "They usually do," Odie said. "The ones worth saving." February came with ice. Not a storm. Not the dramatic kind with warnings and school closures, just 3 days of slow, steady, freezing rain that coated everything in a glaze. The fence lines turned to glass. The paddock became a mirror. The barn roof dripped and refroze and dripped again. and Nadine moved carefully between the house and the animals, gripping the rail she'd asked Gwen's son to install along the path the previous winter. Stuart's death, making her suddenly aware of all the ways a woman alone could fall on her own property and not be found for hours. She moved Weston into a larger stall for the duration of the ice. He disliked this. He had decided that the paddock was his, that the particular square of frozen mud and trampled hay was his domain, and its removal from his daily schedule was an injustice he registered with considerable noise. She brought him extra hay and talked to him about it while he glared. "I know," she said. "It's cold and you're bored and you want to be outside." "Me too." He turned his face slightly away from her in a way that communicated something just short of contempt. She laughed. On the second night of the ice, she woke at 2 in the morning for no reason she could identify. Not a noise, not a dream. Just suddenly awake the way you sometimes are, with the dark pressing in, and the house full of its usual quiet creaks. She lay still for a moment, cataloguing. The cold, the dogs settled at the foot of the bed, the distant sound of ice on the roof. Then she got up. She pulled on her layers, her boots, her hat. She took her flashlight. She walked the icy path to the barn with careful flat-footed steps, one hand on the rail, her breath making small clouds in the dark. She opened the barn door. Everything was quiet. The mares were standing in various postures of equine sleep. The barn was warm, the heat lamps doing their work. She swept the flashlight around, checking, as she always did, for anything out of order. The beam found Weston's stall. He was standing at the front of it, which he never did at night. His head was up, his ears forward, his eyes wide and reflective in the flashlight beam. She walked to him. "What is it?" He moved his head, a gesture she had come to read as something specific, though she couldn't have explained it to anyone. A direction, an indication, something over there. She swept the flashlight to the back of the stall. In the corner, behind the water bucket, was the problem. A small gap in the barn wall, a place where the boards had separated at the base. She had no idea when, probably in the freeze. Cold air was pouring through it, pooling at ground level. The straw nearest the gap was stiff with it. Not a crisis, but it could have become one, especially for a young horse, especially overnight in a sustained freeze. By morning, the cold pocket at the stall's base could have dropped the temperature significantly enough to cause real problems. She would not have found it until morning. She stood with the flashlight on the gap and felt the cold on her ankles, and thought about what she was holding, the fact that he had been standing at the front of the stall, awake at 2 in the morning, waiting. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Good boy," she said. She packed the gap with rags and a board from the supply corner that she wedged in tight, and confirmed with her hand that the cold had stopped coming through. It took 10 minutes. Not long, not complicated. But Weston stood at the front of his stall and watched the entire process, and when she was done and stood up and turned back to him, he came to her and put his nose on her shoulder. He just left it there. Not a nuzzle, not asking for anything, just present, just there. She put her arm around his neck. She stood in the warm barn at 2 in the morning on a February ice night, holding this creature who had nearly died in a frozen field and was now alive and warm and hers, and apparently also watching out for her. She did not cry. She stood still and breathed. She thought about Stuart, which she almost always did in the barn. Not the absence of him, or not only that, but the specific quality of what he had given her, which was not words or grand gestures, but a steady daily presence. The certainty that someone was tracking the same life she was living. The knowledge that if she called out in the dark, something would turn toward her. She had not had that. For 4 years, she had not had that. She thought, I have it now, not the same. Nothing would ever be the same, but something. She held Weston's neck and she felt his pulse under her hand, and she thought about all the coincidences that had lined up to produce this moment. The abandoned mare, the property no one was watching, the foal born alone in a November freeze, the fact that her land bordered that stretch of cedar trees, the fact that she'd woken at 5:15 and gone out in the particular direction she'd gone. One thread pulled differently, and none of it happens. She had never been a person who believed in arrangement, in the idea that things were planned or guided toward each other by anything more than chance. But she stood in the warm barn holding her horse, and she thought, I don't know. I genuinely don't know. What she knew was this: she had found him, and she had stayed, and so had he. And in the cold and the dark and the long years of learning how to carry what she was carrying, that was enough. That was everything. She stayed in the barn another hour. She wasn't sure why. The gap was fixed. The animals were fine. There was no reason to stay. She stayed because she wanted to, because the barn was warm and quiet, and her horse was standing close, and the world outside was all ice and dark, and she was in no particular hurry to return to it. At 3:15, she walked back to the house. At the kitchen door, she turned and looked at the barn. The small yellow light visible through the vents, the soft glow of the heat lamps inside, the whole small structure holding the life she had built. She went inside. She made tea. She sat at the table. She thought, he found the gap. He waited for me. He showed me where it was. She thought, we are taking care of each other. She drank her tea. She was not alone. Spring came the way spring always does, gradually, then with sudden conviction. The ice melted off the fence lines in February's last week. The ground softened through March. By April, the pastures were green in the early morning, in a way that made Nadine stand at the kitchen window with her coffee, just looking, just being grateful for the specific miracle of green after grey. Weston was 5 months old and conducting himself like the owner of the property. He had graduated, around the time of the spring grass, to spending full days in the large pasture with the 3 mares. A transition that Nadine and Gwen had managed slowly and carefully, because introducing a young orphan foal to established mares was not always simple. Horses have hierarchies. They have rituals of inclusion and exclusion. They are, in this way, not entirely unlike people. May, the eldest mare, had surprised everyone. She had been standoffish at first, indifferent, slightly cold, the way an old woman might regard an intrusive child. But within a week, something had shifted. Nadine watched it happen through the fence. May moving closer to Weston, not with aggression, but with something slower and deliberate, sniffing him, allowing him to graze near her. And then, one afternoon, Nadine had her phone out because she'd been hoping and knew it might happen. May dropped her head and pressed her nose against the side of Weston's neck, the way a mare does, the way a mother does. Weston went perfectly still. Then he relaxed all at once into the contact. Nadine took the photo. She sent it to Priya. She sent it to Gwen. She sent it to Odie at the rescue. She sat on the fence rail in the April sunshine and looked at the green pasture and the 4 horses standing close together and felt something complete. Priya came to visit in April, flying in from Portland, renting a car at the Nashville airport. Arriving on a Friday evening with wine and groceries and the particular energy of someone who has been worried about their parent from a distance and is relieved by what they find. What she found was her mother, tanned from weeks of outdoor work, moving with purpose, laughing more than Priya had seen in years. And in the pasture behind the house, a 5-month-old bay colt who came to the fence at the sound of Nadine's voice and waited to be touched. Priya leaned on the fence and watched him for a long time. "He's beautiful," she said finally. "He is," Nadine agreed. "He looks at you like—" Priya stopped. "Like what?" "Like you hung the moon." Nadine smiled. She scratched Weston's forehead in the spot he liked, and he leaned into it with that familiar expression of absolute contentment. "He keeps me honest," Nadine said. "He needs things on a schedule, so I keep to it. He needs exercise, so I'm outside. He needs someone to talk to, so I talk." She paused. "I think I needed all of that too." Priya looked at her. "I think you probably did." Ugh. They stood together at the fence as the afternoon light shifted toward gold, the pasture luminous and calm, the farm settling into the long, soft ease of an April evening in Tennessee. Nadine thought about November, the dark field, the thermos on the fence post, the shape on the ground. She thought about how close it had come, how easily she could have gone back inside, convinced herself it wasn't her problem, waited for daylight, for someone else to find him. She had not done that. She didn't know exactly why. Maybe something in her had recognized something in him, the particular need of a creature alone in the cold, trying to hold on. Maybe she had simply been in the right place, at the right hour, and moved toward the thing in front of her. Either way, here they were. She put both hands on Weston's face and looked at him. He looked back. "You scared me," she told him. His ears moved. He blinked once, slowly. "Don't do it again," she said. He turned his nose and sniffed her sleeve. She laughed. The summer Weston turned one was the summer Nadine started sleeping through the night again. She hadn't fully realized she'd stopped. It happened gradually, the insomnia, the way it usually does, so incremental that each individual sleepless hour felt like an aberration rather than a pattern. She'd been lying awake in the years after Stuart died, running the farm in her head, water levels, fence lines, the perpetual arithmetic of what needed doing versus what she could actually manage alone. That summer, she slept. She thought it was Weston. Gwen, when she mentioned it, said she thought it was Weston. Even Theo, on a routine farm visit, paused when she mentioned it and said, "Honestly, not surprising. Horses are regulated by other horses," he explained. The reciprocal attunement, the shared reading of safety and danger, goes both ways. A calm horse calms the people around it, and a horse that trusts you, specifically you, creates a feedback loop of reassurance that is measurable in human physiology as reduced cortisol levels, reduced stress hormones, better sleep. "So he's treating my nervous system," Nadine said. "In the most literal sense," Theo confirmed. She told Odie about this on the phone in July, and Odie laughed, not dismissively, but with recognition. She said she'd seen it before, in people who'd come to equine therapy programs. The specific thing that happened when a grief-carrying person bonded with an animal that had its own history of abandonment. Two things that had been alone, finding each other. "What happens to the mare?" Nadine asked. She'd been meaning to ask for months. "She's doing well," Odie said. "A family took her. She's good. Does she have a name?" "She does now. They named her November." Nadine held the phone for a moment. "That's right," she said. By August, Weston was taller and shedding his foal fuzz for the sleeker coat of a yearling. He was still curious, still opinionated, still occasionally theatrical about minor inconveniences. But there was a new quality emerging, something quieter, a kind of poise. He was learning month by month to be himself. Nadine watched this with the particular attention she brought to everything on the farm, the attention of someone who understood that life is mostly made of unremarkable days, and that those days are not lesser for being unremarkable. They are, in fact, the whole of it. The mornings and the feedings, and the slow accumulation of ordinary moments until suddenly you look up and a dying foal has become a thriving horse, and you have somehow, without a plan, without a map, become the person who needed him as much as he needed you. She kept the photograph from that April day, Weston and May nose to neck in the green pasture. She framed it and put it on the kitchen windowsill, where she saw it every morning when she stood with her coffee looking out. She had other photographs there, Stuart and Priya at various ages, and the farm in different seasons, the photographs of things she'd loved. Weston belonged in that collection. In late August, Callum came back to see him, the teenager who'd visited in January, now a few months older and somehow even quieter, with the particular inward quality of someone doing a lot of thinking. He stood at the fence and watched Weston for a long time. "He remembers me," Callum said, with something in his voice Nadine recognized. "He remembers everyone he's decided to trust," she said. Callum nodded slowly. "You think he knows? Like, what happened to him? What he came from?" Nadine thought about the frozen grass, the faint pulse, the eyes that tracked her when she moved. "I think he knows what found him," she said. "I think that's what matters to him." Callum looked at her sideways. "Does it matter to you? Where he came from?" She smiled. Less and less. What mattered was November 14th, the thermos on the fence post, the walk across the frozen pasture, getting on her knees, the choice to stay, and everything after. Weston turned from the fence and trotted back toward May, who was grazing in the far corner with the unhurried authority of an animal who has decided she is done standing still. He fell in beside her. He matched his stride to hers. Nadine watched them until the afternoon light went gold. Then she went inside. She made dinner. She called Priya. She told her about the sleep, about the photograph, about Callum's question. "Do you have an answer?" Priya asked. "I have part of one," Nadine said. She looked out the window at the barn, the warm light inside, the horses, the land going quiet in the evening. "I think we were both exactly what the other one needed," she said. "And I think the universe has terrible timing and does beautiful work." Priya was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like something Dad would have said." Nadine laughed, soft, surprised, full. "Yeah," she said, "it does. You know, when I first heard this story, I thought it was about rescue. A woman finds a dying foal. She saves him. She goes on. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized that's not really what it is, or that's not all it is. Nadine wasn't waiting to rescue anything. She wasn't looking. She was just living her life, the way you do after loss, putting one foot in front of the other, getting to the barn and back, making the coffee, making the calls, making it through another November. And then something arrived in the cold and needed her. And she got down on her knees. That's the whole story in 4 words. She got down. She didn't calculate it. She didn't weigh the cost. She just moved toward the thing that needed her. And Weston, this horse who arrived with nothing, who owed the world nothing, who had every biological and statistical reason to not make it through that first night, he decided she was his. He decided she was the center of his herd. He stood at the front of his stall in the dark and waited for her. They took care of each other. I think about that a lot. How often the thing that saves us is the thing we thought we were saving. How grief and need and love have this way of finding each other in frozen fields in November and deciding, without asking anyone's permission, to stay. If this story meant something to you, if it found something in you the way Weston found that gap in the wall, leave a comment. Tell me where you are. Tell me if you've ever had a moment like that, where something arrived that you didn't plan for and changed the shape of everything. Like the video if it moved you. Subscribe if you want more of this. Real stories, told the way they deserve to be told. And take care of your people, the ones in your herd. They need you to show up, just like you need them.